In the last video, we looked at some developmental techniques relating to pitch and rhythm. We saw interval change, where we changed our initial motive and changed some intervals within it, expanding some, like this third to a fourth, and contracting some, like this third to a second. So we had this. And we changed some more as well. We saw some instances of free rhythm change, and we saw tonal and real transposition, or sequencing. Those were instances of tonal transposition that kept us in the same key, and real transposition moved us to new key areas. We also had real and tonal inversions. Here was a real inversion, where all intervals were kept the same, and here was a tonal inversion, where we had we did not keep the quality of the interval, just the number and the direction. And these, of course, could be combined together with other developmental techniques, and we saw that sometimes this resulted in free inversion, where we have some interval changes that just kept the rough shape of the initial motive, just flipped upside down. Now we're going to take a look at a couple precise ways of adjusting the rhythm, and we're going to look at augmentation and diminution. Augmentation and diminution are two sides of the same coin. They both involve taking our original motive and changing the rhythmic values by the same multiple. When we are using augmentation, we are lengthening the rhythm. When we are using diminution, we are shortening the rhythm. And we will do so, as I say, by a common multiple. Typically, in the common practice era, this multiple was often 2, unless we were in a compound meter, in which case sometimes it would be 3. In other words, what we're going to do is, if we are going to augment this rhythm, we will take the note values and multiply their length by some common multiple, usually 2, but we see other instances. So an eighth note becomes a quarter note note becomes a half note, and so on. So in this case, our original motive would lengthen, and we would have this motive. So becomes similarly, if we were going to use diminution, we are going to divide the rhythmic values by some common multiple, usually 2. So an eighth note becomes a 16th note. A quarter note becomes an eighth note, and so on. So our original motive, this simple triad, becomes much briefer, becoming 16th notes and an eighth note. So becomes, we can have this applied to an entire phrase or part of a phrase, and of course we could also mix these with other elements as well. The next few developmental techniques all have something to do with changing the number of notes that are already present in the motive. These include addition and deletion, as well as fragmentation and ornamentation. We'll look at addition and deletion first. Here, what we're dealing with is relatively straightforward in that we are going to either be adding notes to this motive or deleting notes to it. Now, we will see with ornamentation and with fragmentation that we'll be doing something similar. With ornamentation, we'll be adding notes, and with fragmentation, we'll be deleting notes. With addition and deletion, the context is that we're taking something away from sort of the structure of the motive. So, for instance, with deletion, we'd be taking something away from an internal or perhaps an external part of the motive. So internal if it's on the inside, external if it's on the outside. There would be some overlap with fragmentation here. So these would be examples of deletion. When we're dealing with fragmentation, the idea is that we're taking part of a motive. This may end up looking like deletion. And so sometimes these functions would overlap. So for instance, if I took this part of the motive and I cut this part out, it would be the same as if I had deleted that last note. But fragmentation can also refer to just taking this part of the motive, this little bit, or maybe this little bit. So there is some overlap here. And so sometimes you'll see something that someone will refer to as deletion and someone else will refer to as fragmentation. But again, the idea of deletion is that there's something structural in the motive that is being taken out. With addition, we're seeing that there is something that is structural to the motive that's being added to. So in this case, we might have these notes to begin with. And we might add in an extra note. Let's say we'll add in an extra note in the middle. So we'll add in this new pitch. So instead of just, we would have, and we'd know that that becomes a structural part of the motive because maybe that returns and is repeated. Or maybe it is then subject to motivic change as well. Maybe there's an interval change, and we move that motive up. And it continues to build on itself. Now we could continue to add notes here. I'll put that in parentheses, and we'll add on to our initial idea here of C, E, G, E, F, C. And then maybe we'll add another pitch, maybe at the end. And then maybe we'll add even more. And we would know in the context of a piece that these are important to the piece if we see a recurrence. So if we began, then added the F, then added the G at the end, then added say a G and a B, and we continued building on top of it like that. So that would be addition. So we're adding structural things to, or something that at least has the semblance of structure to the motive. With ornamentation, usually what we're doing is we're taking the given notes of the motive and we're adding extra notes that ornament that structure. So this can look like addition, but the slight difference is addition tends to have a feeling of adding some structural element, where ornamentation is simply adding material on top of existing structural elements. And again, that can be ambiguous. The two can sort of go together. So in this case, if I were going to ornament this, perhaps I would want to add in some extra tones in between the notes that are already present. So in this case, I'd be adding in some passing tones. So I could make these all 16th notes. They're sort of my ghost notes, so that we can see that they are ornamenting the original structure. So originally we had, and we could take that and ornament it with some additional notes. There's tons of ways to ornament. Here's just a few more. again, I'll show the skeleton. Maybe we want to have some sort of neighbor motion, like that. And then something like that. So originally becomes ornamented with or perhaps we even want to add another little appoggiatura right there. Something like that. Lots of different ways to ornament, to add additional notes that elaborate on the structure. And so we can see these being added like non-chord tones, but certainly we could have maybe something that's perhaps more improvisatory. Maybe some sort of long cadenza-ish thing here, ornamenting that C. Could even be very quick. And then the rest of the motive continues from there. So lots of different things that we could do with ornamentation. So these are all elements that involve adding or removing notes from the motive. Addition, deletion, fragmentation, and ornamentation. I want to end with looking at two ways of developing motives that are less common in the common practice era, but certainly common in other eras, not just in the common practice, not just in the contemporary era, but in the medieval era as well. So those are retrograde and interversion. When we're dealing with retrograde, what we are doing is we will state the motive backwards. So we would start with this last pitch and go this way. It will be less evident because this is a triad and we get some repetition of pitches, but we will see it present in the rhythm. So we're going to start at the end. We have a quarter note, and then we go up to an E, and then we'd go up to a G, then down to an E, then down to a C. So quarter note C, then E, G, E, C. Here, it's mostly the rhythm that's changed. If we had a motive with less repetition, that retrograde would be easier to see. But retrogrades are notoriously difficult to hear if it is a sort of complex motive or idea. So retrogrades tend to be used less. There's certainly examples of it in the common practice era, but it tends to be used more where we are dealing with something that's very puzzly, like a canon or a fugue. That's usually where we see retrograde coming in. Likewise, we often see it in the Second Viennese School in the 20th century with Webern, Berg, and Schoenberg, again, sort of puzzly music. When we're looking at interversion, we are looking at switching positions of pitches. This is something that's more utilized in the 20th and 21st century, but it's also used in what's called change ringing. That is the practices of bell ringing in cathedrals and churches, particularly in Europe and in England. So here we'd have our starting motive, our simple C major chord. And if we were to use interversion, we'd be switching two of those pitches. So if we use that interversion, the motive would then look like this. So we'd switch it so it looked like that. So becomes, we could switch it again, and it could look like this. And we could continue switching pitches, perhaps like that, until we have a completely new order of notes. So this covers a wide range of different developmental techniques. We began with stating that we're working mostly with pitch and rhythm here in terms of developmental techniques. And we saw first changing intervals in the motive, interval expansion and contraction. Then we saw rhythm change, freely changing the rhythm. We saw that we could have transposition and that this could be tonal or real. This also resulted in sequencing the motive. If it was tonal, it stayed in the key that you were in, and if it was real, then we ended up moving keys. We then saw inversion, and that could be real or free as well, where we took the motive and flipped it upside down. If it's real, we kept the exact intervals with their, not just the number, but also the quality of the interval. And if it was tonal, then we had the we stayed in the same key, we just kept the number of the interval and not the quality. We then looked at some exact rhythmic change. We saw augmentation and diminution. If we use augmentation, we took our note values and multiplied them by some common multiple. Most frequently it is 2, but sometimes we will see multiples of 4 or sometimes multiples of 3, depending on the meter and the context. So in this case, if it's a multiple of 2, then an eighth note would become twice as long, and it would become a quarter note. A quarter note will become twice as long, and it would become a half note. In the case of diminution, we saw the opposite. We saw the note values divided by 2. So an eighth note became a 16th note, and quarter notes became eighth notes. We then looked at adding or removing notes from the motive, and we had addition and deletion, and we saw fragmentation and ornamentation could look like addition and deletion, but with some slightly different tendencies. And then we saw 2 examples of developmental techniques that were less common in the common practice era: the use of retrograde, or running the motive backwards, and the use of interversion, which is switching the positions of pitches within the motive.